Welcome to The Gig. I'm Johnny O, and we do all things tech. Today I want to talk about IT project management. That includes Waterfall and Agile. I'm going to demystify project management, IT project management. There seems to be a lot of confusion on Agile and Waterfall. They think that they're different systems. They're not. Agile is the implementation of Waterfall. They've taken a Waterfall IT project management system, and they've taken the fourth phase, which is implementation, and they've just separated it. There's a group of guys that are called Agile project managers, or Scrum Masters they call them, and they just take the implementation phase and they focus on that. Moreover, they focus on the implementation phase of software development. They call them Scrum Masters or Agile PMs. It's just another PM. It's not a complete system. I'll explain why. A project, any project, I'd say a full project, has 5 phases. Now, let me clear a few things up. In order to be a project, you must have a beginning and you must have an end, or it's not a project. For example, if you have an IT support service and they call it a project, they're wrong. A support service is set up and it's set up to run, and it just keeps running and running and running. That's a service because it keeps going. A project must end. It has an end. It has a beginning and has an end. That's what makes it a project. Another thing that you have to be clear about is a project manager is not a job title. It's a skill. It's a skill like any other job skill, like coding or scripting, or hardware configuration. Project management in IT is a job skill, not a job title. The reason I say that, I've been in companies where they've had guys with no training and they call them project managers. The reason they call them project manager is because they see the word manager and they think that they have a project. So they put a person in charge and call them a project manager. Well, guess what? They're not project managers. They're managers, and they might be in charge of people, doesn't make them a project manager. Now, the first phase of any project is business proposal phase. Business proposal phase is when the internal team, or project manager, or an external team get together with the stakeholder, or the person buying the project, or having the project done, whether that's inside the company or outside the company, whether the project manager is from inside the company or hired from outside the company as a consultant. You've started a project. The first phase is business proposal phase. This is when budgets are basically outlined, and then the project team and the project manager has to decide what they're going to get at the very end and what the customer wants at the very end of the project. That's the whole project. The second phase is the system proposal phase. Now, the system proposal phase must match the business proposal phase. Once the business proposal phase is done, it's signed off on, that's the contract. That's the project contract that says how big the budget is, what resources you can have, and defines all the roles and responsibilities within the project. Now, the system design phase is when you start bringing in engineers, whether they're software engineers or infrastructure engineers, and they start fitting a system within that budget that was clearly defined in the business proposal phase. I've seen business proposals, once they're signed up, I've seen them 200 pages, 10 pages, 50 pages. Depends on the project and how many people are involved. There could be projects with 5 people. There could be projects with 70 people, 100 people. Now that business proposal phase might be 6 months just to hammer out the stipulations in the contract. And it might have 70 people, so big budget stuff. Or it could be 10 people and take a week. But the phase is the same. It must go through the same motions, no matter how big it is and how big the budget is. It must go through the same organizational phase. Once that's signed off, that's the project. That's the 4 other phases are based on the business proposal phase. They must match the business proposal. The second phase is your system proposal phase. That's when you bring in engineers to fit a system within the definitions of the business proposal. The third phase is the system design. The system design must match the system proposal. This is when you go into greater detail of the proposal. I'll go more into that in a minute. Then the fourth phase is implementation, when the work is actually done, when the servers are actually configured, when they're put into an IDC, when the IDC is set up. And then the final phase and the smallest phase is the go live. So you have business proposal, system design, implementation, and go live. All projects, big or small, all fit within that criteria, okay? On really big projects, I've been on multi-year-over-year projects, and they have multiple implementations. And they're all big implementations, especially for infrastructure. When you're building multiple sites, it's this implementation, after this implementation, after this implementation. Okay, so there's phase 6, phase 7, phase 8, and after each one of those phases, there's a go live for that site. And it might have 20, 30 phases, but it fits within that model. They've just taken the implementation and they've duplicated it, the implementation and go live phases, and they've duplicated it. So you can have 30-phase projects, but those projects are basically cookie cutter phases. So you have business proposal, system proposal. The system proposal must match the business proposal. The business proposal defines the budgets. The whole project must fit within that budget. Now, the system proposal, once it's proposed, then it's signed off, okay, this is what we want. Then you go into system design. System design is basically when the project plan comes together. And that's where, when engineers are brought in, they're given the system proposal and they say, this is our budget, this is what we want to do. And then the engineers tell you how long it will take. They'll give you exact days. Then you can plan the project. In business proposal, you don't know how long it's going to take. You can have an idea, especially if you're an engineer. In system proposal, you still don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know how long a project's going to take until engineers say, this will take X amount of months, or X amount of days, or X amount of years. They'll tell you this. That's why they're brought in on the planning phase. The final planning phase is the system design. That's how you know when you're going to, that's when you know how long this project's going to take. And through the business proposal phase, that's when you know how much it's going to cost. So the two KPIs you're looking at, the key point indicators, are budget and time. And that's the difference between a good project manager and an amateur. There's two things that will get a project manager fired. That's going over budget and over time, or both at the same. Going over budget and over time. Then you're really fired. So once you have your system design and engineers said, this is going to take this long, that's going to take this long, then you know how long your project's going to take. That's when you can go back to business and you can say, this is going to take 6 months. This is going to take a month. This is going to take a year. On the smaller projects, especially if your project manager is a former engineer, he can basically tell you how long things will take with pretty good accuracy. Now on these big projects, that's really hard to say. What I don't like seeing is when business guys go in and they say, we have this much money and we want it done by this time. An amateur project manager will go, yeah, okay. No, not until you know for sure and you've talked to engineers and you've organized your project. Do you know how long that project will take? You know how much it will cost because that's defined in the business proposal. Now, the fourth phase is implementation. This is when, if it's a software project, you start coding. If it's an infrastructure project, that's when you start deploying. And you start connecting everything together, configuring your VPNs. It might be a huge VPN network with hundreds of VPNs, dozens of termination points, massive amounts of equipment at multiple sites. Or it might be a new application or a module for an application. Now the engineers start their work. Now, this is where Agile really shines. This is where it's come in. And this is where some guys went to ITPM and they said, look, these programmers, They don't need to know anything about the business proposal. They don't need to know the system proposal. And they don't really need to know the system design. Problem number one. They should know the system design. I'll tell you why. But they basically just took the implementation phase and separated it out of ITPM and said, look, we got this new thing, it's called Agile. Well, you can call it whatever you want. But really, it's just the implementation phase of IT project management. And they've focused on that, and they've organized it individually from ITPM, which is fine. No problem with that. But it's not a full project system or methodology. ITPM is. You can't take Agile and run an infrastructure project with Agile. That proves right there that it's not a project management system. Agile is an implementation system. Moreover, it's an implementation system of software development only. It doesn't apply to anything else. You can't take Agile and build a building or do a big construction project. You can't. It's implementation for software. That's all it is. The guys that are trained and experienced in this, they call themselves Scrum Masters. Now, instead of coding for 3 months or 6 months straight, what Agile does, it breaks up the implementation phase into small phases, really small coding chunks, and they call them sprints. They could be a week long, they could be 2 days long. I wouldn't go over a week. I've never seen a sprint over a week. Even a week-long sprint is a long sprint. I've seen guys with sprints 3 weeks. I'm sorry, that's not a sprint. It's not. It's too long. Okay? Sprint's like 2 days. Then you might have 2 days debugging. Okay? So the sprint is actually 3 days. And then 4th day, you're deploying the code, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. 3 weeks is not a sprint. A month isn't a sprint. Okay? Now you're just doing waterfall. Now, regardless of what you may or may not think or know about Agile, it's still sequential. It's like waterfall. They say, oh, the opposite of doing waterfall project management is Agile because it's more agile. No, it's still sequential. The idea behind waterfall and the description in the name, calling it waterfall, means that one phase must be complete and signed off before you go to the next phase. That's also true with Agile. You can't just keep going back and forth. What happens in Agile, and the reason their sprints are so short, and it makes sense too, especially if you're a coder, is because these business guys, and I've seen it a dozen times, they come in and they just walk on these programmers. And they say, look, I want this feature, I want that feature, I want this feature. And that's after all these other phases, organizational phases, are done and supposedly signed off on and quoted. Okay? And so they add all these things and they go, whoa, we don't know why the project's late. Yeah, you added 50 functions and features to the project. That's why it's late. Okay? Just because it's Agile and you can add things during the implementation phase, because it allows for that. That's the idea. You can allow for changes and a lot of back and forth between business and the developers, which is fine. But if you add 10 functions and features or 50 or 100 new features, it's going to change that timeline and it's going to change the budget. Business guys don't seem to get that. Okay, you told me it would be 10 or 20 sprints in 3 months and this would be done. But it's a month over. Yeah, well, you added 100 functions and features to it. Also, I'm billing you for those. So Agile is very good that way. When business guys come up with new ideas and the coding is already started, the business guys can come in and they can add functions and features. But they must understand, it doesn't mean the timeline that was defined in the system design is still valid. That's going to take another sprint, maybe 2 sprints, and when you add code and you add work to a project, that increases the price, which you must increase the budget to match. Final phase is go live. Doesn't matter if it's infrastructure or if it's a software development project. Once you go live, the go live is the shortest phase. It's when you go live and you go into stabilization, right? And that's when your guys are, your support staff is brought in, and then at the end of that phase, that's when and to end the project, it basically gets handed over to support. So, just a summary. Phase 1, business proposal. Phase 2, system proposal. Phase 3, system design. Phase 4, implementation. Final phase, phase 5, is go live. That's for any project. Agile. Agile is the implementation phase, separated and focused on by certain project managers. Now, there are different kinds of project managers. You'll find a software developer project manager. They're often called Scrum Masters, and they love Agile. And they focus on the implementation phase. That's a special project manager. There's other project managers that are called ITLs. Implementation team leader, that's usually infrastructure. When they're deploying hundreds of switches, hundreds of firewalls over 6 months, they'll bring in an ITL just for that phase. In the design phase, they'll also bring in special project managers or special engineers to design that. Once it's designed, then it's handover to implementation. Implementation implements it, the implementation team. Some big projects might have multiple implementation teams for each site or each software module. And every project will have steering. Steering is only for escalations, right? You have a problem, a developer quit, you need a budget to buy time from a company because you can't hire a developer on time and bring them up to speed. That would be a problem. You would have to go to steering committee. Steering committee gives the thumbs up to hire a service from a company, till the project ends. And they make those decisions. When there's budget and timeline changes and you need escalations, that goes to steering. Steering committee handles that. They usually are the stakeholders too, and they pay for the project, so you want to be nice to steering. Very good. Subscriptions down below, arguments down below, questions, comments. I'll get to your questions, I'll get to your comments if I like them. If I don't, forget it. I'll just ignore you.